everyone. Welcome back to another special edition of Inside the Square. I'm your host, Brent Hamachek, and I have a really interesting guest today. They're the only kind I get to have, and so we're looking forward to it. Inside the Square is a production of the Freedom Chamber, for which I am the Chief Communications Officer. And the Freedom Chamber is the only organization with a national footprint that is dedicated to meeting the needs of the privately owned and small business. So if you're a small business owner and you're interested in improving your mind, your bottom line, and your public policy influence, I would encourage you to go to freedomchamber.net and sign up and become a member. The prices are great these days. And I'm also the Vice President and Associate Publisher for Human Events Media Group, owners of the Post Millennial and Human Events. And so in that journey, I get to talk to a number of interesting people, none more interesting than today's guest. So I'm joined by Leslie Corbly. Leslie, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Leslie, as I'm reading from her PR description, I love this, the maverick millennial, author, attorney, and cultural dissident, unafraid to confront the hypocrisies and hidden costs of progressive culture. That is well written. Not necessarily as well written as your book, which we're going to get to, but it's very well written. Leslie, do me a favor, give everybody what you want to share about your background so they have a sense of you and who you are.
Sure. So I guess my name is Leslie Corbly. I'm originally geographically I was born in Georgia, raised in Oklahoma. I attended the University of Oklahoma for undergraduate and law school. So I'm an attorney. I practice family law at a firm that specializes in fathers' rights, which is kind of right up, I guess, my alley as far as being maybe a little bit of a cultural dissident, a little bit of an uphill battle that dads have in courts in the family law context. So that's what I do for a living, but I also, I write heavily. So I have a background in public policy, specifically in kind of the think of like more libertarian/conservative realm. So I did work on civil liberties specifically related to privacy rights in the digital age. And I have practiced bankruptcy law back in Oklahoma. So I practice law, I've done a lot of work in public policy. I'm very broad as far as my intellectual interests. So I have it's a very broad range of interests, and from law to economics to political theory, I'm probably interested in it and have looked at it before. So the book that I wrote, it's funny, I actually released a book of analytic poems last year, which I kind of didn't expect to do at all.
Of course you did. Of course you released a book of analytic poems.
Poetry. But I published that. That was fun. But I thought this book, Progressive Prejudice, would be the first book I released. And the point of it was to be sort of like weave in both autobiography and cultural commentary to critique progressive culture, specifically the hypocrisy surrounding the progressive tendency to view themselves as very tolerant, loving, and kind. And I think there's a lot of like hypocritical elements to that. There's, I think, lots of groups and individuals, whether they're on the left, right, or center, who don't feel welcome at all in progressive culture, right? And I think that goes far beyond the obvious. Maybe the cis or the heterosexual white man might be an obvious boogeyman to the left, but I think that there's plenty of other people who feel disenfranchised in progressive settings.
So, in the title of the book in full that Leslie mentioned is Progressive Prejudice, Exposing the Devouring Mother. So I thought what it would be fun to do, we're great at labels in this country. And in my own work in writing and speaking, I do a lot of tearing apart labels and finding out that people use words all the time, but they don't have shared definitions. So let's get definitional for a moment and set a premise. When you talk about progressives, tell people what it is you have in mind as you use that term throughout your book.
Sure. So I use the term from what would be called more of a colloquial phrase rather than an academic one. I actually think one of the benefits progressives have is it's really difficult to define their worldview because unlike those who may be religious, Islam has, the Quran, Christians have the Bible, Mormons have the Book of Mormon, right? You can kind of start to define who they are. Progressives sort of have this opaque, open canon where they have all these different flavors, almost like denominations in the Protestant world, but they don't really ever define where they're at. However, I joke that a progressive culture when you live in one, right? So I think of the more campus cultures, right? Cultures that are more elite in a certain sense at this time frame. Obviously, not all elite cultures throughout time have been progressive, but right now, if you were to go in an academic context, maybe a legal or legal some context in journalistic education, you're going to run into sort of a progressive, and generally speaking, progressive worldview. So I would say it came especially from my experience on college campuses where I spent like 7 years, right? And
Right.
then the very progressive cultural spaces.
So the book itself, I had the opportunity, the privilege to be able to read it in advance. It comes out on October 21st, I believe. We'll talk about how people can get it at the end. But it is organized in a very interesting way we'll get to. But I want to do something here. By the way, so reading glasses, folks. As we know on this show, people who have seen me before. I, have that old age eye issue. But right off the top, I want to read your first paragraph. Because it says, for years, I doubted the wisdom of translating my experiences into writing. During this time, I grappled with whether my desires stemmed from fear or prudence. An innate fear resided behind my desire to tear the veil separating society from experiences of those hiding on the periphery of progressive privilege. Yet upon further examination, the jagged pieces of my life fit into a mosaic displaying the embodiment of the type of personhood progressive culture detests and fights tirelessly to eradicate via perverse methods of mental colonization, actualized through emotional manipulation and psychological abuse. I'd like everybody to just sit with that for a second in the sense of that is a beautifully written first paragraph. And so I wanted to ask you right away about you coming at this thing. When you read this book, you understand that you've taken a personal journey and turned it into, you've extracted from it lessons, observations, thought, philosophy, empiricism, and you've come to some conclusions. And I just wanted you to share a little bit about this journey of yours that turned into a book.
Sure. So I think in the very first sentence of the book is rather was sort of the linchpin for me of deciding whether to write it. So my mother, bless her heart, called me half aborted growing up. Now, what that exactly means is lost, I suppose, is only she can answer what exactly she meant by that. But what it did to me as a child was I had to start thinking about issues, very existential issues, very, very early. I mean, I think the sentence Leslie is half aborted is the first sentence I recall learning. So I didn't really, when you're 6, 7, 8 years old, you're sort of going like, well, what does that mean? And obviously abortion is a very politicized issue and it's all over the news. And I think what really struck me as I was going through this was, well, my parents were maybe Christian, you could kind of call them that, but my mother did not like church, so I wouldn't really call her religious. There was a lot of like discussion of religion and God, but I wouldn't really call her religious in the traditional sense. That being said, they sort of played that role externally. So externally, we looked like a Christian family. Um, and so I noted there's all kinds of hypocrisies in the church, and those are fine to flesh out. But what I found really fascinating was that there was no real discussion of what the word abortion did to children. So I remember, growing up and thinking, wow, there's a whole subset of the country where if they knew my personal story, they would think I shouldn't be alive. Like they would think this person went through too much pain. One of the biggest arguments and justifications for abortion is that, you don't want abused children essentially to exist, right? Like how could you possibly want to live under certain types of conditions? And I was pretty well aware that the conditions I was living under as a child were pretty horrific. And so I remembered thinking like, wow, that's fascinating. There's an entire subset of the population that consider themselves to be tolerant, loving, sort of the good guys in the philosophical debate of our time. And yet they don't seem to understand that vis-a-vis the mother-child relationship, they're telling the child that they only should exist at the will of the mother. Right. So there's an entire like philosophical aspect to the abortion debate that I didn't think was being examined at all. And it's fascinating because I actually ran a like social experiment in college where I would tell pro-choice people my life story as if it was a friend. So under the guise of anonymity. And I don't think there was a single pro-choice person that said I shouldn't live. None. It was just yeah, she should have been killed. Her mother would have, it's way, that's what her mother should have done. And so there's that whole aspect of the debate that goes completely, I think, unexamined, because the idea is that, we really center the woman in the abortion debate. And obviously the woman is important in the moral discussion. But what we don't, and to the extent though that we center children, I think we center actual aborted ones. So you think, oh, well, they're dead, right? To the extent that they matter, they're sort of out of the limelight because they get killed. What we don't think of is what does this idea that abortion is a human right actually do to the social relations of families, right? Because I view abortion, frankly, increasingly, particularly as it relates to abortion pill usage, as a form of domestic violence. So imagine, for example, that you were a child and your sibling is killed by your mother in your mother's bedroom or bathroom. What does that do to the child? What if they walk in and see the image of that? What does it do to them? Right? We don't really have those kind of conversations, but it's actually a very bloody process. It's very gruesome, and it increasingly occurs in the home. And it's the only context in which you can quite literally end a life, and that's considered good. And so I don't think, have a conversation about what that means from a child's perspective. I mean, living children who are either aware the violence could have been enacted against them, or grow up with this belief that if that their lives really only matter to the extent their mothers tell them that they matter, right? I think that there's something really psychologically, that's what I use the word mental colonization. That's one of the reasons I use that. There's something psychologically, in my opinion, damaging about being told that you're beneath, as a class, children are beneath the person who made them. I mean, imagine if the Judeo-Christian, I mean, it's fascinating because we think of a culture with God is often critiqued by progressives heavily, right? Like, how could a good God do X, Y, and Z, right? How could he allow that to happen? And yet we don't critique, the ability to take and to create and destroy life used to be a God-like authority, and that's essentially vested in women through the right to abort. That's what you're telling them they can do, and yet you're not allowed to scrutinize why they did that. You're not allowed to question whether it was right. You're not allowed to say, hey, maybe you're actually responsible for this. You should own that responsibility by carrying the child, right? Those are all things you're not supposed to do. So there's this scrutiny progressives will give to what's a God that claims to be, omniscient, all-knowing, perfect, and yet they don't give any corresponding scrutiny to a woman who exercises, frankly, the same one of the powers that used to be
And
alleged to only be given to God. I think that's fascinating.
yeah, interesting. In your reference to the how can God do this piece, of course, part of you love political science. Part of Hume's great disproof of God. The organization of your book is interesting. So, and you just spend time on the abortion piece. And so, folks, in this book, there's a whole series of chapters that have one-word titles before we go to the last 3 chapters of the book that are sort of pulling things together. And they go from abortion to suicide to homicide to amorality. That's what I want to talk about in a minute. Relationship, worldviews, liberty, love, vengeance. And what's interesting is you read each of those chapters, they do not stand alone in and of themselves. They build, they sequence, all starting with that first chapter, abortion. And so I'm wondering if you could I'm curious what your thought process was in putting together a book with that sequential rundown of those one-word chapters, all with interconnectivity.
Sure. So the purpose of it was to sort of try to walk the reader through my journey in some ways to becoming a Christian. So I think I can't really recall a time I wasn't internally thinking about moral, philosophical, and political questions. I mean, I really just don't recall a time I wasn't. And that did come, again, that's why I started with the abortion question, because for me, that's where those existential questions stemmed from. Was I was going, okay, would it have been okay, first of all, for me to be killed? I mean, first we have to decide, is human life valuable in any way? And does that even make sense? And the reason that moved from abortion to suicide to homicide was my internal thought process as I was thinking through, could someone have killed me? And if she can if my mother can assign me value, why can I not assign myself? Or if she can assign me 0 value, why can I not assign myself 0 value? Like, I didn't consent to being here. I'm not particularly much of a fan of what's happening to me. Like, why do I have no say as to whether I remain here? It's like, it's almost, I found it very hypocritical from a progressive standpoint that they would, on the one hand, say, your mother could kill you, and this is part of the social experiment in college. On the one hand, she can kill you, but now that you're here, you can't kill yourself. It's sort of like you can be subjected to suffering, but you yourself have no control over the exit. You can be put here with no, no consent, but you can't remove yourself because that we've decided that's cruel and that's, we can't do that. So I thought
And an interruption on your point, and I want you to continue.
Sure.
It does seem, because what you just pointed to is that as I read your book and in sequence, it does seem as though you're building to create sort of a series of logic traps for people to at least check their own premises on those things about which they're so certain, as if to say, and what you just said is sort of the whole abortion piece, but then suicide's not okay. So you have a demand almost through this for the reader to reconcile their own thoughts.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yes. Yes. And that with homicide as well, because there are many conditions. I mean, I think the reasons women abort, there are plenty of sympathetic reasons women abort. I don't think that's really just in dispute. But what I think is fascinating is that we don't look at similar sympathetic reasons people commit homicide. I mean, there are many reasons that someone could go, I can't bear the weight of the abuse someone's putting on me. I'm going to kill this person. There are actually plenty of sympathetic human reasons someone would want to do that. I can't sit here and pretend. I used Rose Blanchard, who was horrifically abused by her mother for decades, as an example in the homicide chapter for that reason. I don't think many people could honestly say that if they were in Gypsy's shoes, they wouldn't have wanted to hatch a plan to take their mom out. I mean, she was subjected to all kinds of just horrific abuse, both psychological and physical. She was subjected to surgery she didn't need. There were fictitious disorders invented that she never had, that she was then treated for medically. She was put in a wheelchair despite being able to walk. I mean, just the abuse is like full scale and holistic as a human would have to experience that. I can't say I wouldn't have wanted or even enacted the same things as Gypsy. And so I think what I'm trying to do is force the reader to go, okay, some of these common arguments we hear for abortion, why don't we have these arguments in other contexts where life and death is on the line? Again, there are plenty of people whose only reasonable escape from suffering or abuse is death, on some, whether that's suicide or homicide. And yet we don't accept that as normative in society. We may recognize the humanity behind it, but we don't say that's acceptable, right? An abuse victim, frankly, in a lot of contexts, they're just as, they're more impacted. I mean, Gypsy Rose's abuse went on for decades. That's like, eclipses the 9 months of gestational period by years upon years, decades, frankly. And yet we, again, think of this one context as sacred. And by sacred, I mean there's a sacred right to kill. And the child is told their life, again, if you can be killed, then your life itself isn't sacred. And so there's
Right.
all these, I think, contradictions that get balled up in there in the progressive mind. And the reason I went with those one-word titles was to try to build to going, there's progressivism itself. I don't think, as long as it believes abortion is a human right, I don't think it holds a lot of weight as far as saying that everyone should view one another as having innate dignity. And that's a lot of the progressive attack against the right, is that you're unkind, you're intolerant, you don't view people as having dignity. And yet at the most basic level, they don't view anyone as having any dignity. And that's, again, I think a major flaw that goes unaddressed. And it's very much bound up, I think, in gender dynamics, which I get into later in the book.
Right.
But I don't think that that progressives are very keen or capable of really examining their own premises and self-reflecting in that way, because frankly, they haven't been called to account to do that for, I don't know. I don't think I've really seen that in my lifetime.
Right. So one of the fun things about being the host of a show is actually read a book, and knowing that you have somebody on where you could talk all day about the book, but you can't talk all day because you have lives to save and things to do, is that you get to pick what you want to talk about. So I particularly enjoyed your chapter on amorality, not immorality, amorality. And so I want to get to why you chose that term. I mean, I read it, so I understand, but I want you to explain it. But I also want to read, again, back with the reading glasses. So I want to read from that chapter. You say, given the finite nature of the human mind, I knew that those who claim to have rationally selected an ethic from a thorough analysis of all competing truth claims were mistaken, and I knew my chosen worldview could not rest on rationality alone. You then continue a paragraph later. No man or woman is capable of rationality because perfect rationality would require complete knowledge. And anyone claiming such omniscience seeks the status of a deity. God is all-knowing, and if he is not real, then all-knowing is a fiction, rendering comparative human value judgments nearly impossible. For without a reference point of perfection, how are humans to assess the comparative validity of moral values? I find that fascinating insofar as almost sort of a contention with it, except not a contentious conversation. In saying that rationality, it appears you're saying that rationality needs to be somewhat dismissed because it can't be perfect. But then, ergo, I'm led to the conclusion that we need to dismiss everything with which we can't have perfection, which would mean dismissing just about everything. But so as I read that, I thought, I want to ask you about this whole thing about amorality, and you're pushing aside of rationality. And I understand that your religious values are very important to you. So just play with all this. Let's have a little bit of fun, because I thought this was fun.
Sure, sure. So I think what I was grappling with, certainly at the time when I was in high school thinking through this, was this concept of,
Wait, a quick interrupt.
sure.
Folks, she was thinking through this in high school. I wanna ask you, if you're over the age of 40, how many of you have thought about it yet? So please keep going, Leslie.
Sure. So as I was grappling with this in high school, so I had this weird experience, and this is kind of central to the amorality of being. I grew up in this house where friendships were banned. So I was basically told, knew as a child that I wouldn't really be able to have pure friendships until I went to college. That was sort of when you could be initiated into having friendships. So the way I saw that by the time I was about 12, 13, was when you have now a timeline where you can sort of decide what it is, form your own identity, so that when you go out into the world, because obviously it's a very, frankly, incredibly confusing, by the way, to have zero friendships and then be thrust into a collegiate environment. I would not recommend that from a personal development standpoint. That is not pleasant. And so I kind of went, well, I don't want, I remember thinking through a lot like, well, how am I going to know sort of my bearings? I'll have no experience to draw from relationally, because that's hard. So I can either assert my own sort of like internal worldview and then live that out, or I'm left sort of at lost at sea to some degree. And so as I was grappling with amorality, I was sort of grappling with this concept that's often thrown out in culture, particularly in progressive spaces where everyone sort of has their own truth, right? And you can kind of create that, and that there's no such thing as truth. And I came from a very mathematical home, so the concept of no truth, even from a math standpoint, was simply not acceptable, and it was not deemed to be mathematically sound. And so initially, when it came to, again, rationality, the reason I was thinking, okay, how rational am I? We're all to some degree rational, but when it comes to, say, asserting truth and asserting that there's a specific way to live, I think the way I saw it was, well, if I'm asserting my own truth, am I essentially asserting myself as God? And to what degree is that living as if morality, because if you're living as if morality is created by you, to what degree is that indistinguishable from, in some ways, embracing a form of what is often called culturally sociopathology, right? Where you kind of see the world as something you can manipulate and control, and people in it as things that are valuable or useful to you, right? Because if you're sort of saying I'm central as to what truth is, then you're following yourself. And those that make it in your way, can be very easy to justify doing, all kinds of, again, what would be considered antisocial behaviors. And that's where I use the term amorality. Because if you're asserting that there's no form of, if you're asserting that there's no perfect rationality from which you can use that as a judge of your own behavior, right? So, okay, here's perfect rationality. I know I'll never get there, but I can use it to sort of gauge how far away I am, right? And that's sort of in one ways how I think of God. Like, God is perfect. He's perfect goodness. Okay, well, I'm never, I'm not one with God. I'm always somewhere, on this line of going up and down of how close am I to him. And you can kind of use that as a gauge of your own behavior, your own and not just your own behavior, but your own heart in a way, like, what is my disposition towards God at any given time or towards goodness? But if you're sort of stripping that away and saying that man is the measure of what good is, you're saying goodness itself is imperfect and it can't possibly be perfect. Well, so then what are you judging against? Do you get what I'm saying? Because if there's no possibility of perfection and there's nothing against which to judge, then your behavior becomes, in a sense, amoral because you don't really have a moral standard to judge it on. And if that moral standard collapses entirely, then at what point do you have really any authority to judge someone for what's considered to be asocial? Does it
Do
make
you
sense? Or like immoral behavior?
do you believe that it's possible to come to some sort of general collective sense of what is good and what is evil, absent the influence of God and faith, or is that a requisite? Um,
I think you can culturally come to that, but I think at the end of the day, I guess my personal opinion is that it collapses into something that looks like God. So you can not call it faith, or, maybe that's one way to say it. I think ultimately, in order to have a moral code, you have some degree of faith. Whether that faith is in the Christian God or not, I guess is irrelevant to whether it to some degree looks like faith in God, right? So, I mean, even philosophical systems, for example, sort of involved, in my opinion, they collapse functionally into religious systems, right? You don't really have a society without functioning norms, without some ideas that end up being sacred, without, hierarchical thinking of values on some level. So again, I guess I wouldn't say it's a prerequisite to call it God. I just think that's functionally what it ends up becoming.
and has almost the recovery sense of a higher power of some sort.
Yes.
Something with which I'm sadly too familiar. It points to another thing that again, we're back to the reading glasses, and as we close in on the end of time, I just love your book, so I'm just going to read this paragraph because it relates to what we're talking about. Do as you please unless your actions harm others. This, by the way, comes from her chapter on liberty. Sounds good in theory until several minutes of self-reflection bring the wise words of John Adams to mind. In a letter to the Massachusetts militia, Adams stated that the U.S. Constitution was, quote, made only for a moral and religious people, end quote. The document, he opined, is, quote, wholly inadequate to the government of any other. While Adams is no longer able to provide clarifying commentary on his remarks, there is a self-evident truth to his statement. For without a shared understanding of what is good, how is society able to accurately discern what constitutes harm? And so we are in that paragraph, again, just so well written. And I can't stress enough to people that are watching right now, you want to buy Leslie's book, even if you don't agree with premises within it, just because of the beauty of the prose. But sort of a closing thought then on what's required. If people listening to this say we really do want to reverse course on this sort of over-mothering of progressivism, what's the key to it all? Share the key in a 60-second pitch.
I think the key is curiosity. Like, what always came to mind for me was seek and you will find. So, I mean, I wasn't a Christian growing up. I think I became a Christian when I was probably like 18 or 19. And I thought long and hard before I became one. But I think leading with curiosity ultimately is where you'll find what goodness is. So you can't lead with a rule book, and you can't lead by sort of dismissing your ability to think through really tough problems. But I think ultimately, when you want to find what is good, you start by asking a lot of questions. And you start by being really curious and saying, I'm actually seeking what's true. And I think the more you do that internally, I think ultimately that's where you find truth, is by seeking.
I love it. As we said in Dissidently Speaking, the goal should be to flip two words in the English language and have people stop walking around saying it is all the time and start asking, is it?
Yes.
And as corollaries, stop saying they are and ask, are they? And finally, take a good look in the mirror, everybody, and stop saying I am all the time and ask, am I? Leslie, please share with everybody how to find you, follow you. I don't mean find you at home. I mean, that gets creepy, but how do people follow you, stay in touch with you, and all those good things?
Absolutely. So I'm on Instagram at Corbly Leslie, I believe, on Instagram. I'm also on X, and I'll be more active on these platforms as the book comes to launch. I'm also on Substack, so the Maverick Millennial, and that's where I post a lot of my thoughts. And so, yeah, if you just type my name into the search bar of any of either X or Instagram, you'll find me right there. And then my website is lesliecorbly.com, where you'll find a link to my books, as well as if you search my name on Amazon, it should pop right up.
Great stuff. Leslie, absolute treat to talk to you today. Really enjoyed it. Progressive Prejudice, Exposing the Devouring Mother is the name of the book. It comes out on October 21st. So thank you for joining us, Leslie. Thanks, everyone, for watching, and join us again on the next time we have an edition of Inside the Square.